We're going to pick up where we left off in the Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 17. But Debbie, we're going to get to chapter 3, verse 4 today. I'm going to see to it.
You got that recorded, don't you?
Every time he says something.
Looks like challenge is accepted, Daniel.
I'm going to see to it.
So let it be written. So let it be done.
If it hair lips every cow in Texas, right?
Tip some right over.
I want to pick up in verse 17 from last week, because I think in a certain way it will connect with Debbie's verse 4 of chapter 3. It was couple weeks ago, at least, Debbie, after our meeting, was asking about chapter 3, verse 4. And since I believe chapter 3, verse 4 is a part of the same scene that chapter 2, verse 17 is in, there's a connection there that I think will be helpful when we get to chapter 3, verse 4. So let me just read verse 17 again. She is speaking to him whom she loves. And she says to him, "Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, turn, my beloved. Be like a gazelle or a young stag on cleft mountains." And for those of you that were here last week, you will remember the application of this verse is, I think, best understood being spoken by her as it relates to the Old Testament saints and not necessarily to New Testament saints. I think it's a misapplication to take this verse into our mouths this side of the cross. And I have reasons for that. And for the sake of review, maybe we'll go over some of those. But I want us to get clear in our minds that this scene, the second scene that we're looking at in the Song of Songs, it has to do with the time of courtship between her and him. So this is before the wedding day, and I don't know that the time frame, how long this courtship lasted, matters. It's the courtship. It's not the wedding day. It's before the wedding day that she says these words. Now, you'll remember from way back when we began this study that she, in this song, represents the church, represents the bride of Christ. The he figure in this song is Christ, the bridegroom. The she figure in this song is the church, the bride. Now, when we think about the church, when we think about the bride, it's going to become important to make a distinction between the bride during the courtship and the bride on the wedding day and after. It's still the bride, but there's something changes at some point. And so her relationship to him is different after the engagement or the betrothment of her to him. And so the words that she is saying in verse 17, I believe, refer to her as she relates to him during the courtship phase and not where we are, which is during the celebration of the wedding feast, the wedding day having already come for us, not for them, but for us. So to make that point more clear, I want us to turn in our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. The church, the bride, is all of the faithful, all of the believers in God's promises. And that is Old Testament saints, that's New Testament saints, taken as a whole. That is the bride. But before Christ came, the relationships that the believing saints had with Christ was different than the relationship that we, post-incarnation, have with Christ. So let's read for a bit in Hebrews chapter 11. This is the famous chapter on faith in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to jump around a bit or skip verses. We won't read the whole chapter, but I want to read certain parts of Hebrews 11 just to make this the point that I'm wanting to make clearer for everybody. So in Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. For by it the people of old received their commendation. The people of old being the Old Testament saints. And so now the writer of Hebrews is going to go through a list of Old Testament saints. So we first come to Abel in verse 4. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. Abel had faith, and the faith that he had caused him to behave in a certain manner. The more acceptable sacrifice than Cain was the result of Abel had faith. He was an Old Testament believer. Verse 5, by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Enoch was a believer. He had faith. Verse 7, by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise. Jump down to verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Sarah had faith in the one who had promised. She was an Old Testament believer. Verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Jump down to verse 20. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave direction concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. Verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, he left Egypt. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. By faith, this person did this. By faith, this person did this. And so the writer of Hebrews goes down this list of Old Testament believers. As individuals, they're to be seen as Old Testament believers. But putting them together, they are the church. They are the church. Putting them together, they made up the Old Testament church, the body of believers. And so she, the Old Testament bride, could say rightly, chapter 2, verse 17 of Song of Songs. Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, turn, my beloved, be like a gazelle or a young stag on cleft mountains. The body of Old Testament saints that made up her before the coming of Christ had to view Christ as separated by this mountain range of division. And the writer of Hebrews makes mention of this separation, that they had to see. They did not receive the things promised. They received the promises, but they had to look at the things that were promised to them from afar. Right? Back in Hebrews 11, the writer of Hebrews continues down in verse 39. And all these, all of the saints, all of the Old Testament believers that the writer of Hebrews just listed, all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Now, the land of Canaan was promised. The promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as the sand of the sea. The writer of Hebrews makes clear that therefore, from verse 12 in Hebrews 11, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So the promise to Abraham, that was fulfilled. That promise was fulfilled. The entrance into the land of Canaan, the land promise. Did they inherit the land? Did the Israelites inherit the land that was promised to them? Yes. Were they granted the fulfillment of the promise of victory over their enemies within the land? Yes. They were given those promises were fulfilled for them. So what is the writer of Hebrews speaking of when he says down in verse 39, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised? There were many promises that were made to them, and many of those promises were fulfilled. And the Old Testament body of believers did receive many of those promises, the fulfillment of those promises. So what is it that they did not receive? The Old Testament saints, what promise was it that they did not receive? The promised one, Christ. That promise was not fulfilled for them. They had to see the coming one, the coming Redeemer, the promised one from afar, with a mountain of separation between them and him. So those words can rightly be on the lips of the Old Testament bride. But the writer of Hebrews goes on, verse 40 of chapter 11, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So the writer of Hebrews is making a distinction between the Old Testament saints and all of the believers on this side of the incarnation, on this side of the cross, the resurrection, the ascension, Pentecost, the giving of the Spirit. All of us have a different relationship to Christ. Those saints had to anticipate the coming of the Redeemer. We have him. Now, we have him. All the Old Testament saints, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. Something better was prepared for God, for all of us. Something better than what the Moses got to speak with God face to face. Moses got to go up on the mountain and receive directly from God. Those Israelites got to see a wall of water here and a wall of water there and dry ground in front of them. And the writer of Hebrews says, we have been given something so much better than all that. Because all of that pointed to the coming one, but way over there with a mountain range of separation in between them. And something better was prepared for us on this side of the incarnation. So much so that apart from us, apart from what was prepared for us New Testament saints, the Old Testament saints wouldn't even reach maturity, wouldn't even reach the end for which God provided them. That which was prepared for us was necessary for them to reach full perfection. Darren.
Saying that made me think of Moses not being allowed into the promised land. God took him up and showed it to him, but he didn't get to enter. Like us, we're in that promised land now.
Right.
And these Old Testament folks just got basically a glimpse looking forward.
Yep. That's I think it's necessary that we understand how we relate to Christ and how the Old Testament saints related to Christ, and that the words on the lips of the Old Testament church, the Old Testament bride of Christ, could say, verse 17 of chapter 2 in the Song of Songs, but for us, these words are not appropriate on our lips. There is no mountain range of separation between him and us. Something better has been provided for us. And we have received the fulfillment of the promise that all other promises flow out of. The coming one has arrived. Back to our text in Song of Songs. The Old Testament bride of Christ could speak chapter 2, verse 17, because she was in the Old Testament bride of Christ, the Old Testament her, let's say, was in the courtship phase. They got to see the one whom she loved, but there was a separation. There was a necessary separation because it's just the courtship phase. The wedding day has not arrived. We speak as a bride speaks on her wedding day. So there's no mountain range of separation for us, New Testament saints. So let's continue on with that distinction in mind, and we'll read verse 1 of chapter 3 and following. We'll finish out this scene with that distinction in mind, that the words that she is saying for the remainder of this scene require us to understand those words as coming out of her mouth, the church's mouth, from back then, during the courtship phase, not yet having arrived at the wedding day. So she continues, chapter 3, verse 1. On my bed by night, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. It's nighttime. The day has not arrived. It's nighttime. That's why she said in the previous verse, until the day breathes, or until the day breaks, until the sun peeks over the horizon and light shines and chases away the darkness. So she is there on her bed, the body of believers, of Old Testament believers. They have faith. They love him. They have him as the object of their love. But the day has not dawned yet. And so she's there in her bed alone. And it's nighttime. And she's seeking him whom her soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. He's not come yet. The wedding day has not come. So he's not here. He's afar. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. So she can't stand, she can't bear it any longer to be in her bed. Her relaxed state, it's nighttime, and I can bear it no longer. I must see him. And so she gets up. She rises up out of bed, and she searches him out. Her desire to see him is so great that she can no longer be at rest. She rises up and she seeks him out. I sought him, but found him not. Verse 3, the watchmen found me as they went about in the city. Have you seen him whom my soul loves? She says to the watchman. Now, I want us to look at these watchmen. Turn to Isaiah, chapter 52. Isaiah 52. And we'll just start reading in verse 1. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For there shall no more come into you the uncircumcised and the unclean. Shake yourself from the dust and arise. Be seated, O Jerusalem. Loose the bonds from your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. For thus says the Lord God, my people went down at the first into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them for nothing. Now therefore, what have I here, declares the Lord? Seeing that my people are taken away for nothing, their rulers wail, declares the Lord, and continually all the day my name is despised. Therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore in that day they shall know that it is I who speak. Here I am. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. That's the ministry of the watchman. The people of God are the city of Zion, the mountain of Zion. The people of God are the city of Jerusalem. And they are oppressed by their enemies, and it's nighttime. And the watchman publishes peace. Is that what it said? They bring good news. They publish peace. They bring good news of happiness. They publish salvation. They say to the people of God, the watchmen, the ministers of the good news of God, say to God's people, your God reigns. You have been oppressed. You are being oppressed. It's dark. It's nighttime. But your God reigns. And he comes. He is coming for you. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. The Lord is coming. The watchman said to the Old Testament saints. So that's what we see happening in the Song of Songs, chapter 3. She, the Old Testament believers, are in darkness. It's nighttime. And her beloved is far off. And she gets up and seeks after him whom her soul loves, and she still finds him not. But the watchmen tell her exactly where he can be found, exactly where to look for him, exactly from which direction he comes. He's coming from the east. It's nighttime now, but morning is fast approaching. The light is about to chase away the darkness. The watchman found me, verse 3 of chapter 3. The watchman found me as they went about in the city. Have you seen him whom my soul loves? She inquires of the watchmen who publish peace, who proclaim the coming of the Lord. And so she continues, scarcely had I passed them when I found him whom my soul loves. The watchmen proclaim his coming, and I barely got past the watchman, and there he was. There he is. The church, the bride, finally sees up close the one who was promised. Scarcely had I passed him when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who conceived me. That is poetic language, but you don't have to search very far to know what's being talked about there in that poetic language. She finally sees her beloved face to face, and she embraces him. Finally, the day has arrived. The incarnation has come. The promised one arrived for the believers in the one who was promised to finally see face to face. That's why there was so much rejoicing over the little infant Jesus Christ. That's the little infant Jesus Christ, but that's the arrival of the one who has been promised, that we've had to look at from afar, across the mountain range of separation. But now the day has arrived. He's here. The morning has broken. And for the first time, the believing body, the collection of believers in the promised one can gaze in the face of the one whom she has been waiting for, in the person of Jesus Christ. And those that saw him face to face embraced him and vowed, I am not letting you go, ever. That is the mark of every single believer this side of the incarnation. That's now the words that most appropriately fit on the lips of the bride of Christ on this side of the incarnation. The words that the Old Testament bride of Christ had to say was, until the day breaks, don't be far for too long. Don't be too separated from me for too long. I long to see you. Be quick-footed and return. We've caught glimpses of you from afar, but we seek your closeness. We seek the removal of this mountain of separation. Those words fit in her mouth. They do not fit in our mouth. Those words are inappropriate for us. The words that fit in the New Testament bride of Christ are, I found you. I see you. I have grabbed a hold of you, and I am not letting go. Ever. Scarcely had I passed him by when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of him who conceived me. Now there is a picture of the most intimate union that creation can think of. That is we can't point to any closer intimacy than that relationship that's being talked about in that verse. The joining together, the conjugal joining together of a husband and a wife. It doesn't get any closer than that. And she's saying, I'm not letting you go until then. That's why we're being brought together, is for the consummation of this thing. I've been waiting for the wedding day. I've been waiting in darkness for the day of my wedding. And now the wedding day has come because the bridegroom has come, and I'm not letting you go until this thing is consummated. And that's the words that belong to the New Testament bride of Christ. There is no darkness for us, guys. It's inappropriate for us to have a doom and gloom spirit about us when the wedding day has arrived. All of those Old Testament saints had to dwell in darkness before the wedding day. It's nighttime. And they had to wait for what seemed like an eternity for the coming arrival of the one who was promised. Not so for us. He has finally arrived, and now it's time to celebrate. The morning has arrived. The wedding morning has arrived, and it's just brightness, light, celebration, feasting, communion, fellowship. It's the wedding day. For us, it's the wedding day. And so from the incarnation of Christ until today and following, all of that church history is to be viewed as wedding prep. The consummation of the wedding is still in our future. That has yet to happen. But for 2,000 years now, the bride has been adorning herself, preparing herself, making herself beautiful with the lovely white garments that were provided for her wedding day. A beautiful gown has been provided for her. That is let's turn there, Revelation 19. We touched very briefly on this last week. Revelation 19, verse 6. Then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters and like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah! For the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure. A wedding gown was provided for her. Now, we're told what the wedding gown is. The fine linen is the righteous deed of the saints. The righteous deeds of the saints. So every believer on this side of the incarnation gathered together with every believer on that side of the creation, and all of their deeds, all of their righteous deeds, make up the bride clothed in this beautiful gown that was provided for her. And all of church history, from the incarnation till now and following, is simply the bride putting this gown on. She's preparing herself with this beautiful gown that was granted to her, right? She didn't fashion this gown out of her own effort, her own free will. No, it was provided for her. and she's merely putting it on. She's in the process of putting on this beautiful, beautiful gown of righteous deeds. That's where we're at. It's the wedding day. We're not waiting for the wedding day. It's already arrived. Participate, you saints who make up the bride of Christ, participate in adorning yourself with this beautiful gown that's been provided for you. Look at it. Admire the gown. Be in awe that such a beautiful gown has been provided for you. What graciousness our beloved has bestowed on us to give us such a beautiful gown as the gown that he's given us. And we are simply in the process of putting that gown on. Now, I want to spend the rest of our time trying to make clear Debbie's verse. There's a little more that needs to be said there. It's not complicated. It is complex, but it's not complicated. We have to keep in mind, especially in the Song of Songs, especially when we're thinking about the bride of Christ, that the bride of Christ is the body of believers, Old Testament and New. Throughout history, anyone who has placed their trust in the coming one, the Redeemer, the bridegroom, that is the bride of Christ. But that bride of Christ is made up of individuals. I really don't like using that word, but I don't have a better way to say that. There, I'm sure, is a better way to say that. Persons, I think, is a better way to say it. But I want to make it clear that we're talking about Faith Ann and Patrick and Cheryl and Dawn and Debbie and Darren and all of the believers, all of the individual persons that have individually trusted in the bridegroom, that they, being knit together in love, make up the bride of Christ. So there's two things going on at the same time. There's individual persons, and there's the collection of the individual persons. And I think this is most helpful to see what is being said there in verse 4. She says, I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who conceived me. The bride is the church made up of individual persons. Turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12. We'll start in verse 46. The section heading in my Bible above verse 46 says Jesus' mother and brothers. Jesus' mother and brothers. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak with him. So Jesus is speaking to the people. And for all of verse 12, he's been sermonizing, you might say. And while he's still in the middle of speaking to the people, his mother and his brothers stood outside. But Jesus is there speaking. He's proclaiming truth concerning himself, concerning his kingdom. And just outside the door, Jesus' mother, Mary, and his brothers stand outside the door. Now, is anybody reading out of the King James?
New King James.
Who's reading out of the ESV? Anybody?
Yeah, good DSD.
I am.
Somebody read verse 47 out of the ESV.
Hold on. Oh, that's weird. Oh. No, I really, my eyes were getting blurred. Look, wait a minute. I see 46 and I see 48. I don't see 47.
Okay. Somebody read verse 47 out of the King James.
Then one said to him, "Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak with you."
Okay, so we have a manuscript difference. We have a manuscript difference. So some manuscripts do not have that the disciples announced to Jesus, your mom and brothers are outside. Some manuscripts don't have that. Some manuscripts do have that. But all the manuscripts have verse 48 and following. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So there Jesus is. He's speaking to the people, and his mother Mary and his brothers are standing outside the door, and someone alerts him to the fact that they're out there, and he says, "I need you to understand something about motherhood, about these relationships. There is a greater reality of relationship that these relationships merely point to. These relationships are symbolic of the true relationship. And it's these that are my brothers and sisters and my mother. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So I believe what Jesus is saying there is that, Dawn, you individually, just taking you separate from everybody else, are my brother. Cheryl, you are my sister. Now, I have a biological sister. Her name is Michelle. I've known her my whole life. But she's not my sister in the most real sense of that word. Cheryl is. My relationship with my biological sister is a symbol of the greater reality of the relationship that I have with Cheryl, or with Joy, or with Linda, or with Sam, or any of the other women here. The individual men who are my fellow believers are my brothers. The individual women who are my fellow believers are my sisters. But taken as a whole, you guys, not just you guys here, but Larry, Charles, Spurgeon, Paul, Solomon, Moses, Abraham, all of the faithful are my mother. They're my mother. The church conceived me, Daniel Montoya. Deanna Montoya conceived me in a symbolic sense that points to the reality of my true conception. My true conception is that all of the believers throughout history making up her, beautiful, beautiful her, functioned in a way throughout history that at some point focused her attention on me and gave birth to Daniel Montoya, the new creation. She is my mother. She conceived me. And now I've found him whom my soul loves. And me as an individual can say, I held him. I've grasped him. I've gotten a hold of him. And I'm not letting him go until this thing is consummated. And so we as individuals say these words that the only thing I care about, the thing that I most desire is for the final revealing, the final joining together in the epitome of intimacy with my Lord. We say these words as individuals. That is what post-incarnation Christians desire. The wedding day has arrived, and I'm not letting him go until this thing is consummated. And so those words are spoken as a whole. We as individuals all say those words, but we come together. We come together every Sunday. We come together every time we meet, not just here, but 2 or 3 of us get together for lunch, and all of us collectively, without even saying the words, know that we're all grasping a hold of him, longing for that common goal of consummation. And so she says these words, I'm not letting him go until this thing is consummated. And we each individually, clinging to him, bring him with us every time we come into to our mother's house. Every time we come here, that's why we all so care for each other here. Is because, Dawn, you're clinging to him, just like I'm clinging to him. And we bring him with us here into the house. I'm not saying this building, understand that. But this place where we meet together as the body. The church is the mother of us all individually. Turn to Galatians chapter 4, verse 26. Galatians chapter 4, verse 26. Isn't this what Paul is saying? Well, I gotta start reading from verse 21. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children from slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem. The present Jerusalem, when Paul was writing this, was the Jerusalem over there in the Middle East. Before 70 AD, there was an actual physical city that you could touch. That was the present Jerusalem. And Hagar represented that Jerusalem. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. The Jerusalem above is free. There's a whole new Jerusalem who is born from above, born from heaven. And she is our mother. The Jerusalem from above is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. The Jerusalem above is our mother. That's the church. We can see that. If we had time, we would turn to Revelation. We would see the descending out of heaven, this new Jerusalem. That's the church. And we are the bride, the new Jerusalem descending out of heaven, like a bride walking down the aisle toward her beloved. Almost there, almost ready for the final word of union to be spoken, and then the consummation. Debbie, I hope that was helpful. Let's take a break.